Good morning. Today's daf is Gittin daf chet, and let me share my screen. And we are yesterday we posed a question. Specifically, we highlighted the presence of two different brises. In one brisa, if you bring a get in a boat to Israel from out, it seems like from wherever the boat is located, that somehow the get got written in the boat. But the point is that that's where the origin of the get is. So then it's considered like bringing a get within Eretz Yisrael, meaning that you would not have to say b'fanei nechtam, b'fanei nechtam. On the other hand, there's a second brisa that says that when you bring a get in a boat, it's like bringing a get from outside of Israel. So the question that we're dealing with at the moment, hello, Charlie, the question that we're dealing with at the moment is, what's the story? How do you coincide and reconcile these two brises that seem to say the exact opposite things? So Rabbi Yirmiyah offers the first of the answers that we offered, and that was the answer that we offered yesterday. And again, today we're going to begin with the third answer, but let's go through the earlier two answers. So the first answer is that it's simple. The first brisa is the rabbis, and the second brisa is Rabbi Yehuda. And the rabbis say that when you have a boat, even if it isn't touching the ground beneath the boat, it is considered part of, it's still considered in Israel, whereas Rabbi Yehuda says if the boat isn't touching the riverbed, then no, sorry, it is not part of Israel. Then Abaye says the following: no, really, both brises are Rabbi Yehuda. That and the first brisa where it says that it's like it's in Eretz Yisrael, it's because the boat's touching the riverbed, and so as a result, that's why it's considered part of Israel. Whereas in the second, it's not, and so that is answer number two. And so now, as we pick up with the fifth line of Daf Chet Amud Aleph, we're going to have the third of our answers. So Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak Amar, Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak says, Ben Rose to Eretz Yisrael, that actually when you talk about a river that's within the boundaries of Eretz Yisrael, even if it's not on touching the ground, so the Kuliyamalo Pligi, everybody agrees. There's no argument about it. Meaning that it would be like it's in Eretz Yisrael, and you wouldn't need to say b'fanei nechtam, b'fanei nechtam. Elaki Pligi, where are they arguing about? B'yam hagadol. We're talking about a situation where the boat is in the Mediterranean. The Tanya, because we have a machlokas in that regard. And so now there are obviously a number of ways that Rav Nachman's statement can answer our question. We could say, and we'll look at the brisa in a moment, but we could say that the first brisa is talking about when the water that's a river within the land of Eretz Yisrael, and the second brisa is talking about the Mediterranean. Or we could say that actually that one brisa is talking about the Mediterranean where it's inside of Eretz Yisrael, and another brisa is talking about the Mediterranean where it's outside of Eretz Yisrael. And then the final possibility is that we're going to see a machlokas where we could be talking about a part of the Mediterranean where there's a machlokas. So there are a number of different ways that now we can read these two brisas and effectively reconcile them. So we've got a number of different ways to do so. But in any event, let's take a look and see what the story is. The Tanya, because we have a brisa, Ezuhu Eretz, what how do I know that something is part of the land of Israel? The Ezu Chutz La'aretz, and what is considered outside? Kol sheshofeya v'yored miturei amnon v'lifnim Eretz Yisrael. Anything that is, if you take a line and you write the line from the Turei Amnon, the mountains of Amnon, all the way down to Nachal Mitzrayim, so then that is going to be a part of Eretz Yisrael. Mituri Amnon v'lachutz chutz la'aretz. And if you draw that line from the mountains of Amnon and go outside that line, now the way this works, of course, is because on some level, the Mediterranean coast of Israel is concave, right, facing to the left. So then when you draw a line between those two spaces, you include water from the Mediterranean. And so if you draw that straight line, again, you have the coast is going like this, and you draw the line, and maybe I'm doing it reversed, so I should do it for you, and you draw the line between the 2 points, so then everything down and to the left or to the right, I guess, from your screen, would be Eretz Yisrael, and everything up into the left is going to be not part of Eretz Yisrael, according to this first opinion. And let's take a look, and we'll see how Rashi explains. So we're in the Rashi, now basically smack in the middle of the narrow lines. Kol sheshofeya the Yor Mituri Amnon Bilifnin. Anywhere that from the slope from Turi Amnon and in Litzad Eretz Yisrael, towards Eretz Yisrael, Dahainu Litzad Darom, which, as Rashi puts it, is to the south. And that's certainly true. I would have called it to the east, but that's okay. They're both actually accurate. Havi Eretz Yisrael, that's Eretz Yisrael. Degova Hahar Hu Hagvul, because the height of the mountain, that's the border. So Miture Amnon V'Lachutz, and Litzad Safon Chutz La'aretz, and anything that is to the north or to the west, that will be outside of the land. And that's opinion number one.
By that opinion, they've just tripled the size of the land of Israel, the northern 2/3 of which was never settled by Jews.
The what from the Turi Amnon is
Turi Amnon, yeah, that's in Turkey today.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting. So yeah, I mean, I gather that it must be that they think that at some point maybe David HaMelech or Shlomo must have gotten that far.
Never. I mean, there's all the negotiations between Hiram of Tur, which is in the southern portion of that additional area. And certainly Shlomo never conquered Tur. The king is the king was negotiating with Shlomo.
Interesting. Yeah, I don't have a great answer for it. Obviously, there's the inconsistency between the fact that we're talking about, we had just talked about, I guess, yesterday, how Kaziv is the northern border.
That's Aksiv is actually describes the border in numerous places in Chazal.
Right, and so how do we, but the answer that's given here in the notes in Art Scroll is the fact that that is the definition. That's where we got to when we came back from Bavel. But here it just says
it's just a few kilometers south of the Israel-Lebanon border.
Here it notes that maybe it's just to define the territorial waters and not for any other purpose. So it wouldn't actually cover the land that's associated with it. It's an interesting, question as to sort of like especially if I don't know whether the Timnei Amnon Turei Amnon, are on the coast itself, but to the extent that they're somewhat in from the coast, then that might, and given that they're mountains, that could provide an explanation for why they might use it, because as a mountain side, you'll be able to use it as a directional from a farther distance than you would potentially a coastline. So, all right, but in any event, the point is that is the first opinion. So and so Vanisin Shibayam, and so the islands that are in the sea, Ro'inotan Ki'ilu Chut Matuach Alayhan. We see whether there's it's as if there's a line that goes over them. Mituri Amnon ad Nachal Mitzrayim, again from the Turi Amnon until the Nachal Mitzrayim. Min hachut v'lifnim Eretz Yisrael, min hachut v'lachutz chutz la'aretz. So again, anything that's inside is going to be part of Israel. So everything that's outside is going to be outside of Israel. Rabbi Yehuda says, actually, we can expand this very significantly. Kol shekeneged Eretz Yisrael, that anything that's opposite the coast of Eretz Yisrael, harehu ke Eretz Yisrael. Shene'amar ugvul yam v'haya lachem hayam hagadol ugvul zeh yiyeh lachem gvul yam. So the point is why did the pasuk? This is a pasuk in Bamidbar, the end of Sefer Bamidbar. Why did it need to reference the word gavul so many times? You got gavul 3 times in this pasuk. So the point is that Rabbi Yehuda suggests that actually means v'anisin shebetzadin roin otan ki uchut matuach alehen mikfuraya ad yam ha'onkanus. So you go from Kifluria until the Atlantic Ocean, uminachal Mitzrayim ad yam okanus, and so you have a northern one from Kifluria, and you have a southern one from Nachal Mitzrayim, and you go all the way to the I wrote Mountains of Amnon, but I really mean Kifluria, so I'll have to change that. You essentially draw 2 lines, due west, and essentially this very large swath of the Mediterranean would all be considered part of Israel. And I don't know exactly what if anything would actually be covered by that. I'm not
Yes,
sure.
that Steinsaltz has a map. It would include, among other things, Cyprus, Crete, and Sicily.
Wow, well, that's cool.
Well, there's an interesting thing. A few years ago, Rabbi Slifkin was at a Pesach retreat in Cyprus, and the rabbis ruled that they do 2 days of Yom Tov, and the mostly Israeli crowd refused to listen to the rabbi, and they did malacha on the 2nd day of Pesach, and didn't participate in the second Seder.
Wow, very.
Which would be in accordance with this opinion.
That's so interesting. That is so interesting. That
whether they knew about this.
Yes, well, I don't know that we actually paskin like this opinion, so I'm not sure that it has a practical ramification, but it certainly raises an interesting question. Whether one who would rely on this opinion would be considered one who violates Yom Tov or otherwise, doing inappropriate things. But all right. So in any way,
Rambam holds by the early opinion of the narrower definition.
Yeah, that's exactly what I had assumed. So that doesn't surprise me at all. And so, all right, but in any event, Eretz Israel, anything that's sort of between those 2 lines would be Eretz Israel. And anything that's not between those 2 lines is going to be outside of Eretz Israel. And so again, we have these different ways of understanding. And so now we have a third answer for our question. Rabbanan, Hai Ugvul Mai Avdei. So the point is that the reason that Rabbi Yehuda said that we should expand the term gvul to include this entire line of waterway within the Mediterranean Sea, so is because of the extra word gvul. So if the rabbis aren't using gvul in that way, what are they doing with it? So no, the whole point was that if we take the diagonal line from the mountains of Amnon until Nachal Mitzrayim, that's the additional space that's included as a result of the word gvul. For Rabbi Yehuda, why doesn't he, just focus on those inner close by islands or little bits of land? Nisim lo tzricha. No, that wouldn't need any kind of pasuk. That's so obvious that would be considered. Anything within that diagonal strip would certainly be considered part of Eretz Yisrael. All right, so that was point number 1. Now our Mishnah, in our Mishnah, we had a debate about whether Akko is considered part of Eretz Yisrael for Gittin, and now the Gemara is going to use that to answer a question regarding the sale of a slave. So Rabbi Meir Omer Akko ke Eretz Yisrael. Bo minei Rabbi Chia bar Abba Hamocher Abdul Surya Kamocher Kibachutz La'aretz Dami Olo. So if you were to sell a slave to somebody in Syria, do we treat that like a sale of someone outside of Eretz Israel or not? Now, why is that relevant? Well, Rashi helps us out here. Fifth to last line in the Rashi on the bottom of Chet Amud Aleph. Utznan lekamen, we're going to learn coming up on Daf Mem Gimel Amud Bet. Hamocher avdo l'chotzer haaretz la'aretz, that if you sell a slave outside the land of Israel, Yatzal Cheres, he goes free. De kansinan lokeach mishum de evet shayach b'mitzvos v'aser l'tzeid me'aretz chutz la'aretz l'chutz la'aretz. And we do this because we're penalizing the buyer, that he is, because a slave is subject to the mitzvot, and now you're taking him out of the land of Israel and bringing him to chutz la'aretz where he has fewer mitzvot. And so you're not allowed to do that. We already, are effectively punishing this slave enough by having him be a slave. The rabbis don't want to do it. It's an interesting thought that you raises here that, and highlights a point that Rabbi Linzer has made on numerous occasions, that, the Torah points us in certain directions, and sometimes it's not. And of course, the Rambam thinks about this with respect to korbanot, where the Torah doesn't necessarily get us to where Hashem really might want us to be. In terms of killing animals, you can say the same thing about Rav Kook suggesting this in connection with this promoting vegetarianism. But the bottom line is that you can see how the rabbis were to some degree uncomfortable with slavery and wanted to limit it. And so actually, it's interesting whether anybody tried to apply this to the sale of slaves in the South, that if a Jew were to buy them, first, whether any of them would be considered, have to be obligated in the mitzvahs, in the mitzvahs other than mitzvahs Asher Shezman Grama. That's question number one. And then two, that if anybody were to sell them, that would be a problem. But in any event, that's the rule. And so now the question is does the sale of a slave from Eretz Yisrael to Syria enable that slave to go free? So Amar Lahu, Reb Chia bar Abba responds to the question by saying to Nisua, take a look at what our Mishnah said. Rabbi Meir Omer, Ako ke'eretz Yisrael legittin, that Ako is like Eretz Yisrael with respect to Gittin, implying legittin in la'avadim lo, that yes, with respect to Gittin, but not with respect to the sale of slaves. So B'kol shekain Surya, and if Ako isn't considered part of Israel when it comes to the sale of a slave, well, then certainly Syria, which is Merchaka Tuva, that's further away. So as a result, you wouldn't be allowed to. Now that we've mentioned this whole question of Syria, we're going to talk about some rules in connection with Syria. So Tana Rabbanan, B'shalosha Drachim, Gavsa Syria L'Eretz Yisrael, U'Shlosha L'Chutz L'Eretz. There are three ways that it's like Eretz Yisrael, that Syria is like Eretz Yisrael, and three ways that it's like Chutz La'aretz. And in a classic move, we're going to talk about the second of those before we talk about the first. And Simon Ayin Bet Beis Reish Reish Kuf. So Afra Tamei Chutz La'aretz, right? So that the earth in the rabbis made a gezerah that the lands outside of Eretz Yisrael are considered tamei. And that if you're present there, then that creates a sense of tuma, and it's because there's a sense of we don't know where dead bodies are buried because they're less makbid about whether or not where they mark graves, and so as a result, that's rule number one, and that's just like every land outside of Eretz Yisrael. Hamocher Abdul Surya Kamocher B'chutz La'aretz, and similarly, as we just saw, selling a slave to Syria is like you sold it outside the land of Israel, so the slave would go free. And finally, maybe get Syria can maybe get Mechutz La'aretz, can maybe Mechutz La'aretz. And similarly, when you bring a get from outside of Eretz Yisrael, from Syria, it's like bringing a get from Chutz La'aretz, meaning that you would have to say B'fanei Nechtam, B'fanei Nechtam. And so, okay, Ubishlosha la'eretz Yisrael, and then there are 3 ways that it's like the land of Israel. One, chayeves b'maasar ubishvius ba'eretz Yisrael, that you're chayev in meiser and shvius, and 2, v'harotza likanes ba b'tara nechnas, that if you want to enter Syria in a state of Tara, you can do so. And we're going to explain all 3 of these because it certainly seems like this would conflict with the first of the ways that it's like land outside of Eretz Yisrael, because we said that the land is Tameh. So how could somebody who's Tahor, enter Syria if we just said that the land of Syria is Tameh? So we'll see the answer to that question in a moment. And similarly, one who buys in a field is like one who buys a field in Syria, is like Kekona, as we turn to Cherem Abet, Kekona Befarvare Yerushalayim. It's like you bought in the areas around Yerushalayim. So what does that mean? So again, Rashi tells us that we'll explain it in a moment, and so we'll give ourselves a second, and we will now actually go through these last 3 items. So the 3 items that it's like Eretz Yisrael. So item number 1, chayeves b'maaser ubishvius be'eretz Yisrael. That Eretz Yisrael, that it's that you're chayev in meiser and shvius, just like you're chayev, just like in the land of Israel. So why is that? So the Gemara explains, kasavar kibush yachid shmei kibush, that what was captured by an individual is considered part of the land. And what does that refer to? So take a look at the second line of Rashi on the top of Cherem Abet, where it says kibush yachid to David. We're talking about David HaMelech. Shelo hayu kol Yisrael b'yachid. That wasn't all of the Jewish people together. Kederach shahayu b'kibush Yoshua, that when Yoshua conquered the land, it was all of the people working together. And so as a result, it's that's why that situation is treated differently. Shahayu kulam, because all the Jews were working together. Because kodem chaluka, and it was to the benefit of all of the Jewish people, because it was before the land was divided. You can understand why, right? If the land has not been divided and now we have to divide it, so then every tribe will benefit from the expansion of the borders. But if the land has already been divided and you're adding lands, let's say near Shevet Dan's property, well, then you're actually going to be expanding Shevet Dan, because it's not as if that you're going to rejigger the borders, for the rest of Shevet Dan as a result of adding that land. And for the rest of the Shvatim, we've already divided all the land up. So clearly it's going to be to the benefit of some and not the others. So L'tzorach kol Yisrael.
On that, Steinsaltz says a note that Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch hold that this is a rabbinic requirement to do Meiser, to remove Meiser in Syria, which has so that's actually a potential problem with Rashi, because the way Rashi describes it, this might even be biblical, the status of an individual conquest. Well,
not necessarily, and let's just finish this Rashi about David. Lo covers all of Tzarko. David was only essentially capturing it for his own needs, and so as a result, that's why he's not that's not included. I mean, obviously, you can read even this Rashi of Kibush Yachid is just defining the facts. It's not saying whether it's biblical or not biblical, and you can define it as not biblical. But I take your point is that from Rashi alone, you wouldn't be able to answer the question of whether this was a biblical difference or a rabbinic difference. But the bottom line is that based on what you're saying from the Rambam, it certainly would seem like what we're saying is Kibush Yachid is only a rabbinic part of Israel.
Okay. Which means if you eat tevel from Syria, you would get lashes rather than death at the hands of heaven.
Yes, which is, I guess preferable. Okay. All right. So that was item number 1 of how things are like Eretz Yisrael in Syria. So let's take a look and see at item number 2. So the Gemara immediately asks, you just said that one who is tahor is able to enter the land, but we said 2 seconds ago that one of the ways that Syria is like lands outside of Eretz Yisrael is because of it's tameh. So how do you do that? So Beshida Teva Umigdal. We're talking about where you go into the land in some kind of carriage, a trunk, a box, migdal, some kind of vertical closet. So and Rashi explains 4th line of Rashi, Venosin Ota, but Avir, it's where it's carried in the air. And so as a result, if you are in that box, it's not as if you are part of you're not being you're not creating an ohel over the land, and so as a result, it would seem like you're not going to be considered tamei. Masha einkin be'eretz ha'amim. Unlike if you were to do this outside of Syria, the rest of the world, outside of Eretz Yisrael, where we would say that you would actually be tamei. The Rebbe, and this is the position of Rebbe. All right, because Rebbe says that that something that is moving and does not create a sense of an ohel. All right, so the Tanya. And now we're going to have a brisa that highlights this specific difference between Syria and other lands. Hanichnas la'eretz ha'amim b'shida teva b'migdal Rabbi Matame, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda Mataher. I'm sorry, I think I might have gotten that reversed. That Rebbe says that it's tamei, even though it's moving. So my apologies. That it's not because it's moving, but because it's even though ordinarily something that is moving can I'm sorry. I got let me get the facts straight. That because the ohel that you're in, that this person is in, the carriage, the trunk, or the closet is moving, it's not as if you're in anything, because you are in something that's moving, and something that's moving cannot be considered an ohel. An ohel has to be a fixed structure. And so as a result, you're no longer in your own ohel in the carriage, trunk, or closet, but rather it's as if you're just flying above the ground. And so the tumah that is in the ground would go up and make you tameh. And Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda Mataher, but Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Yehuda, says that that's a situation where you're tahar. And when Rebbe says that rule that you're tameh, that's in connection with general land outside of Eretz Yisrael. The Gazru al Gusha al Avira, because we made the decree both with respect to the ground and to the airspace. Aval Surya al Gusha Gazru al Avira lo Gazru. And but when it comes to Syria, we made the Gzera only with respect to the ground, meaning you had to be touching the ground, and not with respect to the airspace. And so as a result, he would agree with Rabbi Yehuda that somebody, that when it comes to a shida teva with migdal, that in that situation you would still be able to be tahor and go in. All right, so v'hakona sada b'Syria, and that's now the third of the final items. How do we? Is like you bought something in the neighborhood of Yerushalayim. So l'may elchasa, to what is this referring? So Amar of Sheshis answers, Lomar shekosvin alav ono v'afilu b'Shabbos, that we will write for it a contract for it even on Shabbos. So in second, b'Shabbos can we imagine that actually a Jew would be allowed to write on Shabbos in that situation? Yes, it's wonderful to buy land, but is writing on Shabbos is violating a Torah act, and that can't be permitted. So Kida Amar Rava. No, we're talking about the way Rava said in a different context. And we'll say what that context is in a moment. Omer la'oved kochavim va'osa. You can tell to a non-Jew, and then the non-Jew will do it. Hachinami Omer la'oved kochavim va'osa. That you would tell to a non-Jew, and he'll do it. So Kida Amar Rava, and Rashi points to Masechah Shabbos Daf Kuf Chav Tet. Now Daf Kuf Chav Tet is talking about a situation where somebody is sick, but they're not so sick that they're deathly sick. And in that situation, Rava says that even though we ordinarily are not allowed to do Amira La'akum on Shabbos, you would be allowed to do Amira La'akum for the health of somebody, even if their life is not at risk. Now, the only interesting issue is, and this is the point, if you see in the at least in my edition, there's a small vav in there which goes to the Masoras Hashas, which points out that actually that Gemara in Masechah Shabbos doesn't quote Rava about this issue. It quotes Rav Hamnuna, but in any event, that seems to be what we're referring to. So the bottom line is that the Afal Gaf, and now we continue. Va'afal gav de amira la'oved kochavim shavus, and even though asking a non-Jew to do something, to do work for you on Shabbos is a shvus, is something that we say sheval tase, just sit and don't do, meaning that you'd say rabbinic prohibition. Mishum yishuv eretz Yisrael lo gazer rabbanan, in order to enable the settling of the land of Israel, so we're not going to we're going to allow you to do it. And Rashi explains that if we take a look at the next Rashi on the left-hand side of the page, Mishum Yishuv Eretz Yisrael legarish ovdei kochavim, to get rid of the non-Jews that are in the land, v'leishav Yisrael ba, and so that instead a Jew will live there. So the bottom line is that you sort of, and the suggestion is that you might actually need both of these concepts in order to make this work. That it's not just enough to just yourself to be moving into the land, but you actually have to dispossess non-Jews from a piece of the land in order to be able to overcome the rabbinic prohibition. Okay.
Well, it also implies that you can actually pay the non-Jews, and in fact, the starting in the 1880s, that was exactly what the Zionist pioneers did.
Yes. Absolutely, 100%.
I
don't know whether to the degree that they actually relied on this leniency, but it wouldn't surprise me if they did in any situation where it was applicable.
Yeah, unfortunately for the Arabs who were living there, they mostly did not own their own land. It was mostly owned by absentee landowners who were the people who actually got the money.
Right. Okay, so we had just mentioned in an aside before, or how we got to the whole discussion of Syria, right, was this question of selling a slave to Syria. And so having mentioned that, and because our next Mishnah is going to also discuss the sale of slaves along with a get Isha, we're going to actually now talk about an emancipation document. And again, I'll remind us that what we saw exactly a week ago, or almost a week ago, no, I guess it was exactly a week ago, that in fact, a get in the word get just means contract, and the contract and the get can refer to multiple contracts. And here we're about to see the word get used in connection with a get shikrur, an emancipation document, as opposed to a classic get which was a divorce document. So Tana Rabbanan, Eved Shehevi Gito, if a slave brings his emancipation document, the kasuvbo, and it says in that document, atzmecha unechasai kinuyin lach, that you yourself and all of my possessions are being acquired by you. So the Brisa says, atzmo kana, he acquires himself, nechasim lo kana, but he does not acquire the objects. So Rashi helps us out to understand. Evet shehevi gito. So Medina Sayam, we're talking about a situation where the get was the get shechrur was brought from outside of the land of Israel. But Sarach Lomar b'fanai nechtav, and so as a result, he needs to say it was written before me. Ki isha, just like with a woman. She hamevia gita damrin b'masdisim, because we're going to see the Mishnah tomorrow, at the beginning of the day tomorrow. That those two types of documents are equivalent with respect to bringing them outside of the land of Israel and bringing them to the land of Israel. So, and then Atzmo Kana, he acquires himself the Ne'emanhu al Shechruro, but because he himself can be believed with respect to the status of his freedom. Lomar b'fanei nektav, to say that it was written in front of him. The aim sarach edim l'kaimo, and so as a result, he does not need witnesses to confirm the document. That his statement is sufficient. Nechasim lo kana, but he is not enough to acquire the objects. Deboy edim, because in that situation we're going to need witnesses to confirm that the witness that the signatures on the contract are valid. Kashar kiyum shtaris, just like by other kinds of acceptance of a contract. In order to receive and accept a contract, we need valid witnesses. Kol nechasai. All right, so those are the Rashi, and so now we're going to have a question. So ibailahu kol nechasai kenuyin lach mahu. What's the story if instead of separating, right? So the first statement was atzmacha unechasai. There were two separate references. One was directly to the slave himself, and the second was to all the possessions. What if the statement involved only one reference, meaning only a reference to all my possessions? And of course, one of the possessions is the slave himself. So Rashi explains 4 lines up in the narrow lines. Mi amrina, do we say do we say that the reference to nechasim, the property, and to the slave are two different things? And so as a result, that is why we separated them in when it said atzmacha nechasai kenuyin lach, or aval kol nechasai. But when I say kol nechasai, when I say all of my possessions, kevan debechad dibura asu, because I'm saying it in one statement, asulei shechur atzmo umatanas nechasim. Do I say that we have that he accomplishes both, that he and therefore it's all good? Kedekaimalan lekaman, as we'll say, hakosav kol nechasav laavdo yatsa ben chorin shehu b'chlal nechasim. As we'll see, that if you were to write all of your possessions, and we know it's a valid contract, as opposed to a contract that's being brought from outside the land of Israel, where we need to confirm it, we would say that all of the possessions go to the person, because the person goes to the slave, because the slave is part of the possessions. So b'klal nechasim hilkach imehemen. If therefore, maybe we should say, if he's believed ahai mehemen ahai, because it's all part of one statement, we should believe him both with respect to his current status as being now a free person, and to his receiving all of the possessions. Delo palginan dibura, because we shouldn't separate a single statement into its component parts. Oh, dilma palginan, or maybe we'll say, no, you can separate the two different concepts even from a single statement, meaning the statement was all my possessions go to the slave. So do we say that it refers to that it covers both subjects, both the slave status and the person, or not? Or do we say that we can't separate them? So Amar Abaye mitosha kana asmu kana nechasim. So Abaye's initial reaction is to say, no, look, he got himself. And in that statement, he also gets the possessions. And so everything goes together. So Amrle Rava says to Abaye, no, I don't like that answer. Bishlama Atzmo Likne, it makes sense that he could acquire himself needed to have a get Isha, because the situation is just like a get Isha. But El Nechasim Lo Likne needed to have a Akiyum Shtaris de Alma. How can he acquire the possessions? The acquiring of the possessions requires a confirmation of documents, and that requires 2 witnesses. So you can't, that's not sufficient. So Hadar Amar Abaye, all right, well then Abaye said back, well then in that case, Mitoch Shelo Kana Nechasim, Lo Kana Atzmo. Well, I would say then that if you can't acquire the possessions, then you can't acquire himself either. So Amrle Rava said back, well, 1 second. Bishlam and Nechasim, I can understand where you're coming from with respect to the possessions, low likni, that you can't acquire it, midi to have akim stars to alma, because after all, you need to have a valid confirmation of the document, which requires the 2 witnesses. But ela atzmo likne, but why shouldn't he be able to acquire himself? Midi to have a get isha, just like he can acquire, just like a woman can bring a get from overseas and say b'fanei nechtav, and she will be believed. Ella Amar Rava. So as a result, Rava says, whether the person wrote atzmacha unechasai kanuyan lach, whether he did it in 2 separate statements, or he just said kol nechasai kanuyan lach, or he just said all of it. In both cases, atzmo kana nechasim lo kana. In both situations, he acquires himself, but he does not acquire the possession. Amrle Rav Ada Bar Masna LaRava. Rav Ada asks, 1 second, come on, who are you? Who is this opinion like that Rava is now saying? It seems to be Rabbi Shimon. It seems to be like Rabbi Shimon, because we're going to see in a moment that Rabbi Shimon allows the division of a single statement to be categorized into 2 different categories, the Amar Kalpakin and Debura, because he says that we can divide a single statement and say that with respect to one thing will hold one way, and with respect to something else will hold some other way. It's not, because we have the following Mishnah, and this is a Mishnah in Peah. If you write all of your possessions to your slave, and this is a situation where we're not talking about bringing it in from outside of the land of Israel, everybody knows that this is a valid contract. Yatza ben Chorin, he goes out as a free man because he is one of the possessions. But Shir Karka Kolshahu, but if the master retains, if the slave owner retains any amount of land, Lo Yatza ben Chorin, then he will not go free. Why? What does he not go free? Well, Rashi helps us. The Bishlama, take a look at the Rashi, 4 lines from the bottom of Rashi on Chet Amabet. The Bishlama Resha, that when it comes to the first part, in the first situation where we just say that all of my possessions, Delo Gali Daita, the Nachas L'Shiyura, there was no intention to leave anything over, Lo Amrinan Deshire. So as a result, we won't say that anything is left over. Aval Hacha, the Nachas L'Shiyura, that he clearly intends to leave something over for himself. Amrinan L'Didei, Nami, will say with respect to the slave also, Shiar, that he's left over. And when he tells the slave that all of my possessions are being for you, ashar nechasim kamer, he's referring to everything else other than the slave. And he's just trying to be nice. And he's not intending to actually free the guy. Because if in fact he wanted to free the guy, then he would say, you and my possessions. But the fact that he just refers to my possessions while excluding something, then we're going to say that it doesn't include him. And that's because we're not going to break down this statement. However, Rabbi Shimon says, as we turn to Tedamid Aleph, La'olam, who Ben Chorin, really the slave becomes free, because we will divide this statement, because we're going to say that when it comes, since the only thing he's excluding is real estate, and he himself is not part of that real estate, so as a result, he is going free. He is going to have his own possessions. And in fact, he'll go free, Ad Sheyomer, Kol Nechas only if the person were to say, all of my possessions are given to the slave except for one part in 10,000. Now, why is that important? Because look in Rashi, Ad Sheyomar Stam. The point is, he says 1 in 10,000 without specifying. Chutz midavar mu'at, stam chutz midavar mu'at. He says specific, generally, except for one small thing. Below yifarish, and he doesn't define what the piece mahu, what it is. Mishayir what he is that he's leaving over. To Hassan Amrim and to Echad Miriboy, that even though, so now we'll say that 1 in the 10,000, to Ka'amar Hainu Ebed, we'll say that that's partially the slave. The Ihu lo chashiv lay, and so now he's not Ella Ke'echad Miriboy, and we'll consider him part of the 1 in 10,000. B'nechasim Avagat Shavutvei, even though he might be worth more. Ka'amar Rabbi Shimon la'olam hu ben chorin. And now, from the fact that we see that Rabbi Shimon in general will say that the slave will go free, Ashmeinan loshna hechad dekana shar nechasim imo kagon sheperish hashir, and so it doesn't make a difference whether he's acquiring the rest of the possessions, or whether kagon sheperish hashir shashire. Chutz mikarka ploni, doesn't make a difference whether he's acquiring himself because the thing that's being excluded is the one piece of land. Hashta kana atzmo v'shar nechasim chutz min hashir, and he's going to acquire all of the other possessions except for this one little piece of land that has been set aside. Beloshna hechad delo kana shar nechasim, and it doesn't make a difference whether the slave isn't acquiring all the rest of the possessions. Gagon shalo his gershem hakarka, where the specific piece of land is not specified. Shishire, that's going to be left aside. The kasav lechutz mibayat kur karka. Like, for example, if he were to say that except for 1 core of land, the hashta lo kana shum karka, because in that situation, since the specific land was not specified that the is being excluded from the transfer, the kol chad v'chad, that any piece of land, ikalamemer hainu hahu deshire, that one could say that that's the leftover piece. Afilu hachi hu ben chorin, but nonetheless the slave will go free. The hu lav karka, because he's not part of the land. Who the lo shire, and so he's not part of what's being held back by the slave owner. So alma palgin and dibura, and so the bottom line is we see we can divide the statements. That we see that when you say all of your possessions, the low kana ella as atzmo, it's possible to divide that into himself, where he and where he can only acquire himself. The nami de ka'amret atzmo kana nechasim lo kana, and so you. Rava, who say that he acquires himself and not the possessions, you seem to be like Rabbi Shimon Sfirullah. You seem to be saying like Rabbi Shimon. So what's the problem with that? We haven't figured out what the problem is yet. So let's see what the problem is, because the problem is based on a statement of Rav Yosef Bar Manyumi, because Amar Rav Yosef Bar Manyumi, so Amar Rav Nachman. And now so that we can understand the question. So we've got the basics, right? The basics is, it seems like Rava is saying like Rabbi Shimon, but we have a statement of the following in the name of Rav Nachman. Afal pisha kiles Rabbi Yossi as Rabbi Shimon, that even though Rabbi Yossi praised Rabbi Shimon, halacha ka Rabbi Meir. Rav Nachman says that the halacha is like Rabbi Meir in that Mishnah that is in Maseches Peah, that Mishnah is like Rabbi Meir, which was the Tanakama's position. The Tanya, because what did we say in a brisa? Kishenemru dvarim lifnei Rabbi Yossi, when the opinion was said in front of Rabbi Yossi, Kara alav, specifically when it seems like Rabbi Shimon presented his position, Kara alav hamikra hazeh. He said that this position of Rabbi Shimon, Svasayim Yishak Meshiv Dvarim Nechochim, lips shall kiss that, that the one that responds with nice ideas. So the point is that it's good, but but it's not actually the way we paskin. And so as a result, that seems to suggest that we paskin like Rabbi Meir. Well, one second, Umi Amar Rav Nachman Hachi. So does Rav Nachman actually say that? So the Amar of Yosef Bar Minyomi, Amar of Nachman, Shechiv Mira, Shekasav Kol Nechasim La'avdo. If a person on the deathbed writes all of his possessions to his slaves, V'amad, and then he gets better, where we say that such a gift is sort of a retroactive gift. Choser b'nechasim, he's allowed to undo his gift of the possessions, but ve'enu choser be'eved, he's not allowed to undo the freeing of the slave. So choser b'nechasim matnas shemira, he can undo his gift of the possessions because that is a gift of a person who is on the deathbed, and such deathbed gifts are conditioned on death. The enu choser be'eved, but he can't undo his slave, his freeing of the slave, shaharei yatsa alav shem ben chorim, because the person is already known as a free person, and once he has acquired his freedom for even a moment, he is, we are not allowed to make him a slave again. After all, because it becomes a full Jew, and a full Jew can't become a full slave. So the point is it's now where we have a different problem. So we had originally the question of how could Rava say like Rabbi Meir, like Rabbi Shimon, when the halacha is not like Rabbi Shimon, because Rava is an Amora, and so as a result, as an Amora, he's not supposed to argue on the way that the halacha is followed with respect to a Tana. And so if we say that the halacha is like Rabbi Meir, Rava should be going like him. But then we said, actually, maybe even Rav Nachman agrees that we can divide a single statement, because look at what he does with respect to the statement of the person on their deathbed. Even though a single statement was made, he separates it into two separate statements, one about the slave and the slave stays free, and one about the possessions where the possessions get to be kept. And so since we can divide, since it's clear that Rav Nachman now holds this position, how do we understand Rav Nachman's holding like Rabbi Shimon? Doesn't Rabbi Shimon disagree with Rabbi Meir with respect to this particular point of whether or not we can divide a single statement? No, Ella Amar Rav Ashi. So now we're going to answer all of the questions by explaining Hasam Hainu Taima, that here's the reason that in fact Rabbi Meir does not disagree with Rabbi Shimon about the ability to divide a single statement. But the problem is that in this situation is different. Mishum delav krus gitahu, because the specific statement of freeing the slave in the situation where a person says, all my possessions are given to the slave, except for this piece of land, that is not a sufficiently clear statement. So even though ordinarily Rebbe Meir would break down a statement into two component parts, and indeed that is what Rav Nachman's view as well, and that's what Ravav says as well. So everybody is in agreement that we would divide statements in ordinary circumstances. However, when it comes to a statement where a person specifically retains a piece, Rebbe Meir says that that is not a sufficiently clear statement. Even though you can break it down, it's not sufficiently clear that the intention is to free the slave. And so, as a result, because Rava's statement of where it says "Kol nechasai kenuya lach" is in fact a sufficiently clear statement, Rava can break it down into its two component parts, the slave and the non-slave. And so as a result, we now have a full consistency. And so as a result, we see that if in fact someone were to write kol nechasai, go to a slave, so then if the contract is totally valid, everything goes to the slave. And if the contract is being brought from overseas, and the only validation of the contract is the single witness of the slave himself, and he says b'fanai nechtav, then we can allow the slave himself to go free. But without the additional witnesses, the rest of the contract and the rest of the transfer will not go through. And so we'll pick up from the two dots and get us to the next Mishnah and continue, God willing, tomorrow. So I hope you'll stay tuned.
Yasher Koach. Have a great 48th day of the Omer.
Yes, have a great 48th day of the Omer. Looking forward to the last of the count tonight and looking forward to seeing you. I will be in person tomorrow, but of course we will also have Zoom as well.
I feel like we should recite Shehechianu tonight,
I know.
but we don't.
I know we do not. It's obviously a classic question, a number of different answers. But you're absolutely right that according to some of the answers, which is, well, we don't know that we're actually going to do it, then we should do, that we are actually completing the mitzvah. But I guess, the classic explanation of why we don't make a bracha, even though you should still continue to count if you miss a day, also helps explain here, because we're not sure whether it's one mitzvah, one long mitzvah, or multiple
49 separate ones.
So
Yeah.
if in fact it was 49 separate mitzvah, so then you should do the Shechianu at the very beginning.
And that gets into the Lag BaOmer, Lag LaOmer. Interestingly, on the on the 33rd day of the Omer, everybody agrees it is BaOmer.
Ah, yes, especially when you say when you reference the holiday.
Yes.
All right.
Yashar Kol.
Have a wonderful day. Be well.
Have a good
Bye-bye.
day.